Work, right? Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session on adaptive and shock responsive social protection. I hope the music will go off, or I have to compete with it. All right, there it goes off. Good. Good afternoon, again, everybody. Welcome to the session on adaptive and shock responsive social protection. My name is Org Hussain Roy. I work as a principal climate change specialist at ADB, focusing on climate change adaptation. And glad to have you all join this session. So we have got in this session about a little more than an hour, and we really wanted to discuss with you all about the importance of social protection in the context of changing climate. It'll be good to hear, for me to understand from all of you a little bit about climate change, maybe. So maybe by raising of your hands, if you can tell me how many of you live in a country that has faced a disaster in the past 1 year? Should I ask more than 1 year? Right, yeah. Well, okay, no? Somebody said no. Okay, great. You're lucky, I would say so. And how many of you have read in the newspaper in the last 1 month about the disasters happening anywhere in the world? If you read newspapers anymore, I don't know what that's. All right, so I think it's what I'm trying to get is that the impacts of climate change are already being felt. So it's pretty much climate change is here now. It's no longer about the distant future. And the impacts are often being felt as very severe, widespread. And in some cases, these impacts are going to be irreversible, which basically means that moving forward, all our country systems, whether it's a financial system, infrastructure system, health systems, or social protection systems, have to be designed, delivered, and operated in a new way, in a way that it can deal with the climate impacts of both shocks and stresses. So what we really want to hear from this session is, from our speakers, we want to understand what are some of the countries doing to put in place a vision. We heard in the opening session by the Vice President of ADB talking about social protection requires a long-term vision. So in that long-term vision, are we really factoring climate change in it or not? And if so, how are countries going about with it? What kind of challenges, issues, constraints they are facing? And how can collectively development partners support countries? So I'm very happy with us that we have with us 4 great speakers. So I'm going to call them to come on the dais. So first we have Daniel Longhurst, who's a regional social protection and cash-based transfer advisor with the World Food Programme for Asia and the Pacific. Daniel, please. Our second speaker is joining online. It's Dr. Agnes Suka, who is the Director for Health and Social Protection from the French Development Agency, AFD. Agnes, can you hear me? I just want to double check if Agnes is online. Okay, we'll come back to Agnes. The third speaker we have got is Rodora Alday, who's a Director for Policy Development and Planning Bureau for Department of Social Welfare and Development in the Philippines. And last but not the least, we have got Dr. Suprayoga Hadi, who is a Deputy of Policy Support in Human Development and Equality Secretary to the Vice President Executive Secretary of the TNP2K in Indonesia. So thanks, all of you. I do want to again go back and check with Agnes, if Agnes is online and if she can hear us.
Yes, I can hear you.
Great, thank you. Lovely to hear, Agnes. Thanks for joining so much. So great. So the way the session is structured is we have about 10 minutes roughly for each presentation. We'll start with Daniel, who provides a big overview of what's happening in terms of the framing of the topic of adaptive and shock responsive social protection. Then we'll hear from Agnes about what AFD is doing in the region, what are some of the lessons we have learned. Then we'll move to 2 countries, Philippines and Indonesia, to hear about what are the countries doing to take this agenda forward. Then we'll open up for discussion. And what I really want is at the end of the session, we should find a couple of key recommendations on if we want social protection systems to be a one sort of response to climate action, what is the kind of support we have to provide to countries for them to enable such a system. So with that, maybe I'm going to hand over to Daniel first for your presentation. Daniel, please.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Urgo, and distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a great pleasure to be here today to talk to you about this topic and also to be on such an interesting panel with my colleagues beside me. So I'm here to give, as Urgo said, an overview of this topic and what we're seeing in the Asia-Pacific region. I've been personally working on this topic for a range of actors now for about 8 years, and we've seen a significant evolution of the topic during that time. So what I'm going to do today, if you could just go to the first slide, I'm going to talk about 4 things. I'm going to talk about the rationale. Why do we need adaptive and shock responsive social protection? I'm going to talk about definition and aims. So what is it? I'm then going to talk about some progress to date. How is this playing out in real life? And then lastly, I'm going to talk about future investment areas. Where could we be doing a bit more? Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. So in terms of the rationale, I'm not going to labor this point too much, but just suffice it to say, and this has been touched on by various speakers, including the keynotes at the beginning of the day, we are seeing lots of key metrics going into reverse. We have 700 million people living in extreme poverty and 770 million people undernourished. 52% of them are in the Asia-Pacific region. We also see, alongside that, and aggravating that, a quadrupling in weather and climate-related events over the last 40 years to around 400 a year. And we expect that number to increase again by 40% by 2030, unless we take very quick corrective action, climate-focused action. So the IFRC estimates that will put another 200 million people potentially in need of humanitarian response by 2040, and cost the global economy 29 billion a year. Also to mention, of course, that 13 out of the 30 most vulnerable countries to climate change are in Asia-Pacific. The point I wanted to mention here is that these risks are compounding. They're layering on top of each other, and people and the systems that support them are not able to address this compound risk fast enough. Whether that's weather-related events, which we may focus on today, but also, of course, our minds are all set around the previous experience of economic shocks, as well as epidemiological shocks like COVID. And this is driving and affecting some of those rates of poverty, malnutrition, and maladapted livelihoods. Next, please. Alongside this, the other point I wanted to make is that we've conventionally seen social protection expansion, drastic social protection expansion, during these large covariate, these large global shocks. So whether that was the economic crisis of 97, whether it was COVID, whether it was the inflation crisis. So whilst social protection is not the magic bullet, it's going to be part of the solution. It is, however, stretched. Coverage and institutionalization is uneven across countries and demographic parts of the population, and we know that investment is low, particularly in Asia-Pacific. The global average for investment in social protection is 12%, and in Asia it's around 7.5%. So we know that there's a foundation upon which we can build to address compounding risk, but we have to think smart and flexibly about how we do that through social protection. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this brings me on to the definition. So what is it? We've talked about why do we need it. Now what is it? I want to be careful here about slipping into semantics, but just to flag, there are lots of different definitions flying around. climate responsive, disaster responsive, shock responsive, adaptive. What I wanted to focus on is the similarities, because essentially they're all saying a couple of key things. The first is that adaptive and shock responsive social protection is about the convergence of three sectors: climate change adaptation, disaster risk management, and social protection. And it's about sharing roles, responsibilities, and capacities across those three sectors. The second, when it comes to social protection in particular, is that we're not only focused on life cycle shocks for the individual, but also how these systems can address large-scale covariate shocks that affect lots of people at the same time. Both acute need, but also how we address underlying and chronic vulnerabilities as well. So that means that adaptive and shock responsive social protection and regular social protection are not different. They're two sides of the same coin. You need a foundation to build off your social protection system, but those systems themselves have to be future-proofed for climate change and other shocks that are coming down the track. And then last of all, it's about interconnecting key building blocks. It's about interconnecting policies, systems, programs, and finance together. And this is what we see across all these different frameworks, but it would be interesting now to see if we have that at country level. Next slide, please. And just click one more time. Thank you. So I just wanted to flag this picture, this graph, which I find rather illustrative of the challenge that we face. Along the x-axis, you see countries ranked against the World Risk Index, and up the y-axis, you see coverage of social safety nets. Now, while shock responsive social protection is not only about social assistance, you can do it across social insurance and labour market policies as well. This is nevertheless the challenge before us. So the countries facing the most risk are also often those with the least coverage of social assistance programs. And my rough count was that somewhere between 12 and 16 of those countries from that slide are in Asia Pacific. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we're seeing from progress around the adaptive and shock responsive social protection agenda, I wanted to flag the big picture before talking in a more granular manner. We know from COVID and the inflation crisis that we saw a massive increase in investment in social protection as part of the response packages. We saw 3,856 programs put in place globally to respond to COVID at a cost of $3 trillion US. And in East Asia, South Asia, and the Pacific, governments spent about $600 billion US. This also nicely shows that after the wave of COVID, we went right into the inflation crisis, where 1,300 or so programs were put in place, a global cost of $1 trillion, and South and East Asia and the Pacific spending $335 billion. So governments stepped up when the chips were down, and they put their money where their mouth is. But the question is, how much of this will sustain, and how much investment are we going to do ahead of the next shock, ahead of the next wave? Because that is also where we get our efficiency and effectiveness gains. Next slide, please. So we have a very heterogeneous region, and I'm not going to be able, we're not seeing progress in the same way in all countries. I've just wanted to pick out some of the things that we've seen happening in some of the countries to give you a sense of progress. I'm going to talk first about system architecture and knowledge management. We're seeing in some countries a move from project-based focus to strategies and policy, including thanks to ASEAN, Cambodia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So what this means is that governments want to plan for this, budget for this, track it, and report on it in their midterm development plans and also against the SDGs and other global commitments. We're seeing system assessments. So we're beginning to see assessments that ask across the different building blocks, do we have what we need in place to call this system genuinely adaptive and shock responsive in a couple of countries? We start to see disaster risk financing policies being put in place, as well as instruments and initiatives in countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, Cambodia, Fiji, the Philippines. And I'm going to come back to this point. If I were to leave one message with you, it would be we have to match appropriate finance with appropriate program solutions. So this is a good trend. We see some evidence developing on the impact of these investments, including impact assessments and scoping studies and public expenditure reviews. And last of all, we see operational guidance. This stuff is really important to understand who's going to do what when, and the process is as important as the outcome, getting the right people around the table to agree that cross-sectorially. Next, please. In terms of program design features, what are we seeing programmatically? Of course, we've seen a very large number of programs responding to those two global shocks that I just mentioned, and that list doesn't do it justice. I think we can safely say almost every country in Asia and the Pacific had some kind of shock responsive or adaptive program in place. I wanted to also flag that in countries where you cannot work with the de facto authorities, there are also programs that could be labeled shock responsive or adaptive social protection in Afghanistan and Myanmar. We're seeing a lot more work linking forecasting, climate vulnerability and hazard mapping to scalable social assistance programs, to socioeconomic data. So essentially understanding not only who is poor, but who is vulnerable to shocks, where they might be, and where, with the effects of climate change, might the newly vulnerable be. So this is a very, very important evolution. We've seen some very rapid advancements in on-demand registration. This means that our socioeconomic data can be updated in a more dynamic manner, which is really important particularly for shock response, so that we understand who is most vulnerable for that shock, who has the most acute need. And we're seeing some joint programming in places like Pakistan, Cambodia, and Indonesia, bringing those building blocks together, institutions, systems, programs, and finance. Next slide, please. So, okay, we've gone on one, no problem. So in terms of 3 investment areas, I wanted to label those as the 3 Ds. For this region, I feel are particularly important if we're going to kind of further institutionalize and upscale our work. The first is on data, the second is on delivery chains, and the third is on dollars, regular and risk finance. So on data, we need more of it. We do need more of it, about who is affected where losses come from in terms of individual households, but also by sector. We need different ways of understanding multidimensional vulnerability. I've talked about understanding a bit more about climate hazards, where they will hit, who will be affected, and we need more robust evidence on the return of investment. We also need to drive digitalization. I think that's going to be a common theme that you're going to hear about in every session, and that means integrated information management systems, interoperable systems between government and other partners, and linked to that downstream delivery capability, so that we know that the right people get the right support at the right time. And to do that, we need to facilitate access. That means ID, that means digital financial literacy, with a particular focus on women. Next slide, please. The second is delivery chains, and what this means is linking up the finance to the targeting, to the modality choice, and then the kind of circle-based learning to understand if we got to the right people with the right support at the end. And this means designing programs for specific shocks, not retrofitting the program that you have necessarily for any shock that you can think of. We need to be more specific about what shock we're trying to address and what program and adjustments to that program make the most sense. And I would argue we need more joint programs in this area. I think we need a further focus on integrating this into a sort of a comprehensive policy-based response. And that also includes enabling governments to act quickly and in a decentralized manner when different shocks are coming and after they've finished. We need to invest in coordination. This is probably another key message, and that coordination has to also be at decentralized levels. The capacity has to be built with those that are implementing and having to invest the time in getting everyone around the table. And we need to feed program learning back into policy design. We need to invest in South-South, and we need some focused on people-centered design and delivery, including marginalized groups. And then next slide, please. And lastly, investment area number 3 is dollars, regular and risk finance. As I said before, if there was one message I could impart with you today, it's that this topic globally for the last decade has been dominated by programmatic solutions without financing solutions. And the next 10 years, we really have to focus on what the financing solutions are for these shock-responsive programs. So that means both regular tax-based revenue potentially and also private sector market-based solutions and matching financial instruments to different hazard types, whilst not forgetting the underlying investment in reducing chronic vulnerability and providing transformative wraparound support. And to do this, we also need a better collective understanding of what these instruments are, what their prerequisites are, what you're signing up for when you go for one, and how you get the right kind of finance out to the right people. So, next slide, please. These are my final thoughts. I think for the sake of time, I won't repeat them. Suffice it to say, I think that some of the things that we talk about a lot, and you're going to hear about in every session, apply here. How do we integrate better to get the multiplier effects that we need? That means bringing the right people into the room. That means investing in coordination. And I would say that that also means thinking about what finance we're going to use to tackle this, because then programs follow in a more coherent manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, for the excellent presentation. It helped set the scene and highlighting the issues around 3Ds of data, delivery chain, and dollars. I do want colleagues in the room to think about, I think one question that Daniel raised about, so we need programmatic solutions, but those programmatic solutions has to lead to programmatic financing also. So how does that happen? I think it's important for us to discuss. I will move to a second presenter. Agnes, if you're there, time is yours. We have got 10 minutes for you, please.
Thank you. Do you see my slides?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me now speak a little bit about the experience of AFD, Agence Française de Développement, in actually implementing these instruments that were just presented to you. In AFD, social protection and adaptive social protection are really at the heart of our priorities. It's one of our 3 main areas of work that we offer to countries when it comes to supporting the development of health and social protection systems. The other one being the commons, focusing on institutions. That includes national health insurance mechanism and human resources for health, particularly around the strengthening of health systems overall, including the hospital systems. Thanks to projects in 2022, we committed about 422 million to health and social protection. And I want really to emphasize that we really focus on the social protection part of it, with 2.2 million people benefiting. And the nutrition aspects are also very important and link to this question of vulnerability, including climate vulnerability. So when it comes to adaptive social protection, we actually quickened and increased the financing of adaptive social protection projects during the COVID-19 crisis. So first, during the state of health emergency in Togo, for example, AFD co-financed the rollout of a new digital cash transfer program for 600 beneficiaries. In Bolivia, AFD co-financed through a 100 million loan 2 safety nets programs aimed at households with school children and aiming at addressing the issues of people with disability and pregnant women. Another third example is in Mauritius, where we provided social assistance, which is something we do in many contexts, to prepare the installment of a new social register. So protecting people against the acceleration and amplification of external shock is, according to our experience, both an absolute necessity and a considerable challenge. What we had to face over the past few years, for which we got significant increase in demand for supporting countries to develop their social protection systems, the COVID-19 crisis, then the food price crisis, and climate shocks and natural disasters, including most recently in Pakistan. What does it mean? It's like we really see the reality of the poly-crisis and the fact that increasingly social protection is the first level of response to this crisis. And the example of the increase in transfers, monetary transfers during the COVID-19 crisis is really the proof of concept that we were all expecting to happen when such a crisis, massive crisis, hit all the countries at the same time. So in Agence Française de Développement, adaptive social protection is really a key pillar of our strategy in social protection. So what does it mean in practice? And again, we focus mostly on strengthening institutions. That's the heart of it. It's about the social contract, and it's about developing the tools and instruments for social protection, including the capacity to be adaptive to shocks, including expanding registries, social registries, to better include climate vulnerabilities criteria and reinforce local human resources in the sector. Second, the financing instruments. We support and contribute to appropriate financing mechanisms, allowing coordinated and anticipated financing from both governments and external contributors to respond to crisis. And here, the extreme importance of developing pooling mechanisms that can expand at the time of crisis. Finally, explore and leverage partnerships to mobilize more resources to finance both social protection systems and adaptive social protection programs to cover not only the poor, but all people vulnerable to shocks and contribute to the climate adaptation agenda. And this is where we've been really working very closely, including with the World Bank and bilateral donors in the Sahel, in sub-Saharan Africa, following droughts linked to climate change. And we worked with different partners, including BMZ, FCDO, Denmark, etc. And we work in supporting this pooling mechanism that can receive flows of funding before crisis through government resources and donors, but also help step up the level of funding during the crisis. And now, adaptive social protection is at the heart of a joint agenda that we are developing in the Finance in Common network. The Finance in Common Summit is a network of public development banks, including Multilateral Development Bank and the World Bank, in which all development banks try to work together at supporting a joint agenda. And for social protection, it is particularly important to have all the financiers on board, including local development banks such as Afrexim Bank in Egypt, that can actually bring the knowledge of the deep and granular knowledge of country issues, but also provide a bridge between national institutions and international institutions. I don't seem to be, yes. So what do we talk about? We also pay specific attention to accompanying measures of national cash transfer program. And that's really what we see as what need to be integrated in adaptive social protection that are a response to the adaptation needs of countries that are confronting the challenges of climate change. These accompanying measures can be educational and productive inclusion measures in order to contribute to household resilience in the long run. They can be programs that respond to food and nutrition insecurity, that link to, for example, addressing the issues linked to food insecurity during the lean season, better link the cash transfer beneficiary to health insurance schemes, which is something that we pay a lot of attention to in many contexts. And of course, what is essential is this link with national institutions, including national development banks, and strong government ownership of adaptive social protection programs. So the safety net programs and the cash transfer are actually the backbone of the program. And next to this backbone, it is possible to attach accompanying measures, supplementary programs that strengthen and reinforce the effect of the safety net programs. So it can be around nutrition, like distribution of fortified flour to children. It can be around health, like awareness campaigns in sexual and reproductive health. So for example, in Burkina Faso, we finance about 10,000 beneficiaries through cash transfers within this national safety net programs. But the same beneficiaries, all women, receive health and nutrition and gender specific training and support programs that are co-financed with AFD by the BMGF. Another example of accompanying measures are the environmental measures. So still linked to this backbone of safety net programs and cash transfers, you can develop programs that address the climate vulnerabilities and the environmental consequences of climate change. And that's the example of well desalination, prevention of coastal erosion, also temporary house relocation, which is something that immediately happens when facing an extreme weather event. So for example, in Jordan, AFD finances a project where local social centers can provide shelter to people whose house has been lost due to extreme floods. Another type of accompanying measures, in a way more classical, are the productive measures. Something that we've been working with the World Food Programme quite a bit in different contexts. The productive measures can be income generating activities, financing training, access to agriculture inputs, village savings and loan associations, subsidies that are linked to production of agriculture products, business training and entrepreneurship. So in the same way in Burkina Faso, we're working right now towards the co-financing of these productive measures associated with the new National Empowerment Program of Poor and Vulnerable Households. And it is really our firm belief that these accompanying measures program that can be either productive programs, that can be environmental, or that can be social, are really maximizing the effect and amplifying the effect of cash transfers, but also that cash transfers is really essential to make these programs actually accepted and be a useful tool that delivers results. That synergy is absolutely essential. So 3 examples quickly, full projects that in which we're funding adaptive social protection. I mentioned the Sahel Adaptive Social Protection Program. Since 2018, we financed the national program of cash transfers that is reactive to shocks to support vulnerable households during the lean season, during the dry season. Cash transfers are given in priority to women within the households. Recently, in 2022, we pledged 12 million euros for 3 years to the National Fund to respond to food and nutritional crisis in the country. So building the main mechanism to anticipate financing to respond to food insecurity in the country is the essence of this program. And this fund represents a major step in the institutionalization of the adaptive social protection in the country, building the national institution that bring together the cash transfer programs and the other social, productive, and environmental programs. Another example, more recently in the Philippines, the food stamp program, we are currently preparing a national food stamp program to be launched in 2024 that we co-finance with the Asian Development Bank and Japan to design and execute a pilot project together with the World Food Project and of course the government of the Philippines. And it will be targeting 3,000 poor households that are vulnerable to climate change, including pregnant and lactating women, and with a focus on local food systems through local retailers and cooperatives. Finally, my last example is Bangladesh, in which AFD supports the modernization of the national social protection system and the emergency answer to the COVID-19 crisis. And it really allowed to continue the existing cash transfer programs and, importantly, the creation of a contingent emergency response, which we think is also part of the adaptive social protection box of instruments. In 2021 and 2022, we supported the government response at the same time, response to the health crisis, and help provision of quality healthcare through investments in infrastructure and human resource training, as well as contributing to universal health coverage through the expansion of non-contributory insurance that we actually linked to the cash transfer programs and to the identification of households with both economic and climate vulnerability. So Bangladesh is really an example in which we link the health social protection system, including health insurance, with the both the climate emergency answer and the building of an overall social protection system, strengthening local institutions. So what's going further ahead? Again, our key message here is that social protection, and particularly the response systems, safety net, preparing response to shocks, is really the backbone of adaptation. We need to strengthen social protection institutions and their ability to implement autonomous policies, because when any extreme weather event, any crisis is happening, the first instrument that we need is the safety net. The first instrument is the possibility of helping the population affected at the time of crisis. And at the same time, as an anticipatory measure, cash transfer is also the backbone on which you can really build to introduce different programs as per the need of communities and developed in conjunction with these very communities. So what is important there is really the community diagnostic, and that extending adaptive social protection in more countries will need to cover not only the poor, which we were doing more traditionally, but all people who are vulnerable to shocks. So the key instrument there, as was mentioned before, in terms of building institution, is of course to build social registries, to have those registries be expanded to include climate vulnerabilities criteria, and to deliver emergency programs to those populations that will face the crisis, not only to the 15 or 20% poorest people that were identified in programs whose main objective was poverty reduction. So that's a kind of a shift, but also the huge opportunity to build the response to climate and the adaptation strategy on whatever the community working on social protection has done in the past years. Of course, this requires also to mobilize more resources to finance both social protection system and adaptive social protection programs, and to have those programs institutionalized so that for donor programs, there might be exit strategies in between crises in which programs are funded by local governments and national governments. Finally, really this point of linking cash transfers beneficiaries to different type of accompanying program is to us essential, with these three main programs: health generally, and we can also include some nutrition, but also the productive programs and the environmental programs, which we are increasingly introducing, linking environmental action to the protection of those vulnerable communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Agnes, so much for sharing with us some of the practical examples through which AFT is rolling out adaptive social protection, specifically looking at strengthening institutions, providing financing, and strengthening partnerships. I know I'm not doing a great time management over here, but I'll move to a third presenter, Rodora from Philippines, to share what Philippines is doing in this context. Thanks. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Magandang hapon. As we say in Filipino, good afternoon, magandang hapon sa inyo lahat. So thank you for inviting the Department of Social Welfare of the Philippines to share with you our experience in our initiatives for developing adaptive and shock responsive social protection programs. So allow me to present to you what will be the topics I'll be covering. Of course, I'll begin with the Philippine context, followed by what were our challenges in the social protection delivery system, and of course, our initiatives on adaptive and shock-responsive social protection. So as a background, I think everybody is very familiar that the Philippines, according to several studies, is exposed to an increased number of more intense extreme weather events coupled by impact brought about by climate change. And as we speak, there are 2 volcanoes that are very active, and we are actually having floods in Mindanao. So it is also projected that temperatures in the Philippines would likely increase by 1.8 degrees Celsius to 2.2 degrees sea levels. Sea levels are also rising, wherein it has been reported that a 14.4 millimeter rise was identified in Manila, 6.0 millimeter rise in Legazpi, 1.2 in Cebu, and 3.6 in Mindanao. So that's the cost of the flooding that we see every time there's a heavy rain in the country. Okay, sorry. So next slide, please. I'm on the next. Okay, so that's it. So in the recent indices as well, the Philippines grabbed the top spot, not in the Miss Universe, but in the 2022 World Risk Report for the most disaster-prone country. So being vulnerable to impacts of climate change, the Philippines ranked 114th out of 181 countries according to ND Gain Index. So this measure somehow gave a picture of the country's exposure to multiple shocks that aggravate people's living conditions. So and as such, it was estimated that the country's economic losses reached up to 1.2% of the GDP because of typhoons, projecting that damages could reach up to 7.6% and 13.6% by 2030 and 2040. So respectively, this results in adverse effects of the country's agriculture, coastal communities, and people's health and welfare, to name a few. Next slide, please. So as mentioned by David earlier, shocks drives social protection expansion. So that's the case of the Philippines. But I would say that a well-in-placed system actually would assisted the government in providing for the immediate relief and response during times of crisis. So we had a well-placed system way back in 2012 that helped us prepared when Typhoon Haiyan hit the country. So we had a targeting system, a registry of the poor household, we have financial service providers, and a well-structured machinery to do the payouts. So it was easy for the humanitarian agencies and development organizations to easily implement cash for work programs and other emergency cash transfers. And that was the first time we introduced emergency cash transfers. And after that, we continually do ECT using our current social protection delivery system. And of course, the same delivery system, next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so it's the same delivery system that we used when we implemented our I think biggest cash transfer programs, and to name a few, we had the unconditional cash transfer in 2018. The purpose of the unconditional cash transfer was to actually assist households who would be affected by the increasing prices of fuel because of the increasing taxes. And then we have, of course, targeted cash transfer because of the inflation rate way back in 2022. And of course, we implemented the biggest, I think, social amelioration program during the time of COVID-19 pandemic. So we were able to deliver cash transfers to about an average 17 million Filipinos. But our experience in delivering cash transfers actually exposes the weakness of our current system. And to name a few, next slide, please. So we have a problem with targeting. So we have actually several registries in the Philippines. One of which is, of course, our National Household Targeting System, or our database for poor households. We also have other maintaining social registries. So the registry of for farmers, which is being implemented by another government agency. And right now, we are also we have the implementation of the community-based monitoring system that would be the basis of identifying and developing of social protection programs in the country. So we have actually not so integrated, consolidated, and interoperable geospatial-based targeting system. And recently, despite of the targeting system that we have, a study from NEDA revealed that still bottom 40% of income those in the income have lower coverage. 40% have lower coverage in 2017, 2019, and 2020 compared to the total population. So we have large coverage gaps in terms of the population. So in terms of another challenge was the timely delivery of assistance, because we are decentralized. We have to work with local governments, and of course the current institutional mechanism is that each of there are several actors or agencies who are delivering social protection programs, so we have to work with them. So naturally, we have vertical integration, and horizontal integration becomes a challenge. And of course, it becomes now a trade-off between speed and accuracy. So we really have to strengthen not only the system, but also of our institutions, so we could deliver well, so we could have the efficiency and effectiveness schemes of social protection. And of course, the another challenge is that actually prevents us from delivering our services is the lack of access to financial service providers and credit. Still, many of because we are serving the poor Filipinos, and of course, they have no bank accounts. They have no some of them have no access actually to digital wallets. So imagine that we have to do payments manually. So every time there's a cash transfer. And of course, the third, I think, challenge is the transfer value. So earlier you had a whole session on inflation and social protection. I think the point that we want to drive on the transfer value is that if we want to build long-term adaptation and resilience outcomes, the transfer should be able to assist households to invest in assets, in developing their assets. So if not, I think the current transfers right now are still susceptible to shocks. So meaning the gains of social protections over time have been undermined already. So next slide, please. So what are the current initiatives? Because of our experience from the time of Yolanda to the current, it was easy for the Philippine government to adopt the concept of adaptive and shock-responsive social protection as a strategy in our operational framework. So we know that we have to align it with disaster risk reduction and management, humanitarian assistance, and climate change adaptation. Afterwards, through the assistance of FAO, we were able to come up with an adaptive shock-responsive social protection roadmap, which was adopted by the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council through Resolution Number 7, Series of 2021. And after following that adoption, we had a DSWD UNFAO work plan, which was formalized in 2021. But prior to the formalization of the work plan, there's already an anticipatory action technical working group co-chaired by DSWD and FAO. Next slide. Okay, so this is the strategy framework for social protection plan of the Philippines from 2023 and 2028. So we'll just focus on the three strategies that we will be doing for the next 6 years. So there are three. The first one is the full implementation of the social protection floor, which the country recently adopted. So the social protection floor actually addresses individual life cycle risks. And to complement it, of course, the adaptive and shock responsive social protection is to address covariate shocks. And of course, the third one is on rationalization, modernization, and digitalization of our social protection system. And next slide. And some of the initiatives that you can find in the social protection plan is one is the on mainstreaming approaches in hazard risk responses that are anticipatory, adaptive, and shock responsive. So we are working on the passage of a bill on the declaration of state of imminent disasters that is aimed for anticipatory action to be institutionalized as one of the DRRM policies of the country. So if we were able to enact a legislation, we will be able to access different types of disaster risk financing mechanisms. Because right now, the department or the government can only access the quick response fund only after the disaster has happened. So we cannot do there is no funding for anticipatory action. And then, as mentioned earlier, we need to improve our data management and our information system. So the next initiative is the development of predictive analytics for humanitarian response tool and enterprise geographic information system. Next slide. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, it's not only the size of the transfer, but of course, we have to link our existing social assistance program to other social protection instruments such as labor market interventions or social insurance programs. And then, of course, currently, in terms of the integration and mainstreaming of safeguards, in the development interventions, in partnership with the UNDP, we are currently developing a national resilience index. In terms of diversification of livelihoods and income sources, next slide. We're looking at the implementation of agricultural credit program survival and recovery loan program to actually assist our agricultural households in calamity-affected areas. And of course, lastly, we are now currently piloting what we call BSPARED, which stands for Building on Social Protection for Anticipatory Action and Response in Emergency Disasters, together with FAO and ECHO. So we are now testing the provision of ex-ante interventions prior to the onset of the disaster to mitigate the risk and shock. So currently, I think next week there will be a series of capacity building with the local government units and other scientific agencies are already done. And we will be, I think, starting by as early as next week. So this ends my presentation so we could have more time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhara, for sharing Philippines. I mean, it's 10 years from Typhoon Haiyan, right? 2013, 2023. It's great to see how progress you have made. And I think the proposal on the bill on anticipatory action is simply fantastic. If it goes through, I think it's really progressive, right? Pa Yoga, your time. For Indonesia, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Argo, Wendy, and also ADB to having me here. Let me start with some area to be discussed actually this afternoon, because we know that adaptive and shock responsive social protection already been adopted actually in many countries. And I think it's going to be very good for me to share about how the Indonesian government trying to cope with this kind of issues. Next. There are some issues need to be discussed. Just three kind of issues. One is context. The second one is how we try to be adopted actually the adaptive social protection in Indonesia. Before that, I would like to explain about a little bit about the social protection policy, and then the key takeaways actually, how we are moving forward actually in implementing such unique and complex adaptive and shock social protection. Next. So starting with the context that Indonesia is a very prone disaster area. Next slide. And we know that it is very clear that every single disaster impacting in the poor people, the poor community, and also the vulnerabilities, the risk is going up and so on and so forth. So it's going to be very good to try to do the correlation actually between the prone area and the poor area, which is very similar actually in Indonesian context. And we know that it is very common, like just recently actually, a month ago, President just released actually the subsidy for rice actually, because of we are preparing for the El Nino, for instance. It is very clear that we are trying to cope with this kind of situation by having a very direct and immediate actually assistance to the impacted people. Next. And then about the social protection policy itself, it's very complex actually in Indonesia, and we know that this is very lifetime actually, the life cycle, the social protection in Indonesia, since the maternal and early childhood, and then we have the children, productive, and also the elderly. And we have the individual-based programs. It is very various actually, like the one that we already given. We have here the colleague from the Ministry of Social Affairs giving the Family Hope program. We're giving also like the food stamp, like the Philippines case, and we have also the cash transfer, unconditional and also conditional cash transfer, and also the basic needs. I remember that this morning we just heard from Secretary of the Ministry of Social Welfare of the Philippines about the needs, the right, the basic, and also the basic needs, food and energy, the subsidy. It is very clear that we're giving the full subsidy as well as the energy, like, and also for the agriculture, like the fertilizer. And also we have also the location-based program, like the village fund and so on and so forth, like the Kalangi seed actually here in the Philippines. It's very various actually, and quite different level of government also impacted. Next. And on the developing an adaptive and social shock responsive social protection system, this is also much more complex actually, because we have also actually some opportunities and some challenges actually. We know that the social protection is not alone. We have also to deal with the data information. The targeting data is very important. I agree with the Secretary of the Pakistani this morning about the social economic registration. We are now in developing in such data for by name, by address, for 280 million people of Indonesia. It's already been developed right now. Also the financing, and finally the institutional arrangement. So that's going to be very, the four pillars of the social protection, the adaptive and shock responsive social protection already been developed or being developed actually, along with, of course, the regular one. Because we know that the regular one, like the social assistance, already been given by the Family Hope program, and also the direct cash assistance, and also the unconditional cash transfer. It's already been adopted, and whenever the disaster happen or preparing for the next disaster, the social assistance is very flexible actually. So the adaptive and shock responsive already been actually implemented in Indonesia for a couple of years ago. Next slide. And then the future, how we try to combine actually the social assistance and the social insurance. Maybe tomorrow Pak Livi will explain more about the social insurance. We know that this is a very lifetime cycle, yeah, about the social protection, protecting people across their life cycle. And we understand that because we need to make sure that the access to the decent livelihood is and jobs. Yeah, it's already been discussed actually in the this afternoon in a different room. This very clear that how the decent jobs and also livelihood, yeah, along with the disaster happened. It is very clear to be responded by the government as well as the local government, and also participating in all the respective stakeholders. And then finally, the final bottom is the adaptive and shock responsive social protection. So that's actually the building of the future social protection system in Indonesia. The social assistance and social insurance, and then we have the access to decent livelihood and jobs. And then finally, at the bottom, is actually the adaptive shock responsive social protection. That's actually building up the social protection system to whole Indonesia. Next. And then finally, the key takeaways. We know that it is very clear that talking about this kind of sustainable and inclusive and also resilient social protection system for all, because we are talking about the life cycle. The problem is the poverty in Indonesia, even though it's now getting better, we only already less than 10%. The total poverty now is 9.36% towards 7.5 hopefully next year. And the extreme poverty now is only 1.12%. We are approaching 0% actually next year. It is very actually earlier than the SDGs. SDGs is going to eliminate the extreme poverty in 2030, but we are going to end the extreme poverty next year actually, hopefully. And then that the government, not only central government but also local government, is having the same responsibility actually in giving the acknowledgement and also the importance of the social protection. Because this is not only the responsibility of the MOSA, for instance, but also the responsibility of the local government or even the village fund. Village fund is also working beautifully actually in dealing with this kind of protection, social protection, as well as the adaptive social protection. And it needs to be adapted into the current system, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that it's already been adapted elsewhere, and now trying to be adapted within the context of Indonesian political system. And then finally, strengthening the existing database, data by name, by address, and sustainable financial infrastructure. We have the RFI already, disaster risk financing and insurance actually, and try to cope with, of course, the climate change adaptation as well as disaster risk reduction. And then the final things that I would like to explain is about how to improve actually the capacities, because the coordination is very important actually. Talking about the social protection, we are not only talking about one ministry, but more than 10 ministries actually, like the poverty alleviation, for instance. We have the extreme poverty line ministries involved. It's about 28 line ministries involved. So the coordination is very important actually. The second one is about how we try to also invite the participation from the non-government organization, which is very crucial, because the government cannot do everything, and we try to have like with multilateral organization and also bilateral agencies. We're having quite intensive communication actually, like in ADB, DFAT, the World Bank, very much actually. And finally, actually, try to have the social protection, also the risk management and the climate change adaptation. I've been working with Argo, for instance, for community resilience partnership program, which is very important actually to be adopted as one of our attention actually on how the social protection will, addressing actually the poverty as well as the social problems, as well as vulnerability and so on and so forth. So that's the way we are trying to this kind of policy actually in coping with this kind of situation. Okay, I think less than 10 minutes. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Pa Yoga, for saving 30 seconds. But great presentation on the overall approach Indonesia is taking. I do have sort of questions for all of the panelists, but I'm going to keep them aside and maybe open up for to hear from all of you. if you have any specific suggestions, inputs from your side on the session, or specific questions for the panel, it'd be great to hear from you. So anybody wants to start? I'm sure there are questions in the room.
Hello, this is Ruki. I'm a NorCap cash gap expert, seconded to WFP in Fiji. I actually have a question about the social registry. So basically that adaptive and social responsive, shock responsible social protection initiatives are designed to be flexible and responsive in a case of like the disasters. So for the this actually allows us to capture the people who are newly under the poverty line or who become vulnerable in, let's say, one night. So I see the good examples of Indonesia as well. And there are actually only 73 countries in the world who has a social registry system. And there are a lot of initiatives of the development actors working on this. So my question is that basically that what are the key challenges which we can work towards, not only as only the development actors, but the government and also humanitarian actors to ensure to support the social registry systems in place in the government so that we can have adaptive and shock responsible social protection programs more effective. And second question is that basically how do we at the moment ensure the quality of the program that we are having, such as the case of Burkina Faso, in the implementation without a social registry, so that to be more practical.
Thank you so much. Can we have a couple of more questions before we turn to the panelists? Anybody else? Yes, please, at the end, corner.
Just wondering if we need to specifically mention adaptive shock and shock responsive and inclusive social protection, because most often the most marginalized are left out of the systems, because we are also talking about building on the existing systems of social protection. So it's important to look at inclusive social protection specifically. Thanks.
Absolutely, totally agree. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for all the speaker and the moderator. This question for Dr. Agnes Sukat. If you could compare between a few regions like Asia and Africa and some of the part that AFD is dealing with, especially during the COVID-19 and maybe slightly after, can you compare the region differences in terms of adaptiveness and responsive to the shock in terms of COVID-19? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Daniel, do you want to start from your side? First question. With the first one, yes.
Sure. A very good question, talking about the digital backbone that underpins all this work, and you're very right to highlight that there are countries without these kind of information systems, and there are others that are in different forms of realizing them. They're not also generally built until very recently to address shocks. They are designed to address longer term programs, and their data is more static as a result. So I believe you know the essence of your question was essentially how can we work with these social registries and improve them for shock responsiveness and adaptiveness. And I just wanted to flag three things. With varying degrees of difficulty and innovation. The first is that I want to return to this point about understanding who is vulnerable to what where. So if we're talking about climate-related hazards, we now have the capacity to know, both through longitudinal analysis and through forecasting, with a much higher degree of certainty where the prevalent weather-related shocks are going to hit. So I think there's a lot more investment we can do in anticipatory registration, so not enrollment, but in registration of at-risk households, both poor and near poor, depending on how you define it, in those key climate hotspot areas, so that you have their data as a baseline at least to then act when that shock occurs. And again, if we're thinking about the shock typology, there are always one or two prevalent hazards that a government knows they have to plan for and that they could invest around this or work with development partners on. I think the second thing is the really exciting advancement around dynamic updating, on-demand updating. So I think that we've learned through COVID that with some teething trouble can work, and that people obviously this is once the shock has hit, they can indicate that they are in need of support, and systems are capable of responding to varying degrees to that support. So making and integrating that dynamic updating, I think, is the second key factor. And I'd add to that, let's learn a bit from how that worked for COVID, because there were some good and some not so good experiences. And then the third one, I think, is about financing. We do need to find a way of mapping out what this is going to cost to develop and sustain these databases over time. And I'm not sure in many countries we have that picture. And that also has to include within it data protection concerns. So how much data are we collecting from people? How current is it? And what access do they have to it so that they can determine whether or not they want that data to remain held centrally and used across different programs. So I think these are sort of three areas that come to mind when we talk about this kind of digital backbone architecture.
Thanks, Daniel. Agnes, I'm not sure if you're around. There's a question specifically for you on experience of AFT in terms of regional differences and which region you feel are more, have programs in place in terms of adaptive features. Agnes, are you able to hear us? Sorry.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, one of the there was a question on the different approaches we have, but one thing that I want to emphasize is that we systematically invest in these registers. That's really a fundamental pillar of adaptive social protection. And one thing that we face in many contexts is the fact that there are multiple registers, it was mentioned during the discussion, but particularly registers that are in the humanitarian or refugee space. And one of the things we do in the Sahel, particularly in the regions that are very prone to droughts or floods, is the bringing all this data into one single register. And then, of course, the issue is how to regularly update these registers in contexts where the population is quite mobile and you have quite a lot of migration. During the crisis, clearly, I think one of the lessons of the crisis is that fast response to shock requires a national mechanism that are able to transfer resources rapidly to those who need it. And whether it is households or small businesses, the counter-cyclical policies that distribute cash and help cushion the impact of the crisis is absolutely essential. What we found is that those countries who already have, of course, a national system with national institutions tended to do better, because when we look at the response to COVID, it was mostly a national response. It was mostly a domestic response. So yes, financial institutions mobilized a lot of money, and in particularly development banks and international financial institutions did very well in mobilizing additional money. But this money was actually used and disbursed only in countries that had the mechanism to do so. And in fact, in the data, we can see that a lot of the countries which have weak institutions were not really able to use this financing in 2020, and had to really rely to reallocations within their own budget. The second thing that I want to say is that indeed it was mentioned that social protection is probably less developed in Asia, particularly in East Asia, than in other parts of the world. And I think that's the balance with the strong service delivery. This region tends to have a level of service delivery which is quite high, and that has been given the priority in kind of integrated delivery systems and public delivery systems. In those countries, indeed, there has not been until recently the full realization of the power of social protection programs. And I think there are many cases in which the emphasis pre-crisis was given on service delivery, well, health services, primary healthcare services, primary schooling, hospitals, etc. But we see that when there is a shock, those are under shock too. And the traditional mechanism may not be working. They often don't work anymore. And then there is really a need to transfer resources directly to the population affected, and also directly to the providers, and this can include private providers. We see also that the resilience to shock is linked to engaging all kinds of frontline providers, not only relying on a public system that might be quite rigid and may have some time lag or difficulties to react in crisis. So that's really, I think, one of the lessons we have learned, and that leads us now to have really revisited our social protection strategy towards this goal of building institutions, building capacity, and focusing on these core instruments of registers, financial engineering, that financial systems that allow transferring cash at the front line, and the building of pooling institutions that are also managed in close relationship with communities.
Thank you so much, Agnes. Thanks a lot. That was excellent. I'm conscious of time. I do want to summarize some takeaways from me, and I'll come back to the panelists asking them one question on where do you think an institution like ADB, which is a multilateral development bank, can contribute towards adaptive social protection. I'll give you some time to think about it. But from my point of view, so I don't work in social protection space. I work in climate change space. And there are 5 key takeaways I take it to my climate change community. Number 1 is that it's very clear. In the climate space, we talk nowadays about transformational solutions needed. What I did hear from Philippines and other colleagues is that social protection programs, if it's proactively building resilience of the poor households and not just their coping capacity, can potentially be a transformative solution if supported properly. Number 2, in the climate space, we always talk about solutions that are country-led through country systems. And social protection is a country-led system which we can perhaps build on. We talk a lot about importance of cross-sectoral solutions, and I think Agnes's presentation talked a lot about accompanying solutions of linking social protection with livelihood, with jobs, with housing, etc. That's excellent for me. 4th is the importance of partnerships. I think Payog also talked about partnerships with civil society organizations, partnerships between national and local governments, and this is very important for climate solution. And last but not the least, we know financing is an issue, and I think Daniel talked a lot about it. It's not just about availability of financing and adequate financing and predictable financing and timely financing, but also financing that is much more programmatic, much more longer term, much more flexible for you to allow building such a system. So with that, I'm going to turn to maybe Daniel for you. What can institutions like and MDBs like ADB can do in the space of adaptive social protection? Very quickly.
Okay, three things. I'd say the first is work on digital convergence, and that's right from the architecture level, the enabling environment, the regulators, the treasury, down through the financial service providers. But also, I would urge you to be bold and have a people-centered approach that addresses, that provides products and services that are adapted to the end user. The second thing I would say is around joint programming. I mean, use the partnerships you have with government and the convening power that you have to encourage more joint programming in this space. And the third one, I think you've alluded to it, and I'm not sure, again, I don't think we talk about it enough. On the one hand, investing in green growth and climate resilient livelihoods, we see programs of that nature that do not have the underpinning of social protection. We see people in those programs who are also not supported by social protection. If something happens to them, that investment is potentially lost. And at the same time, on, say, social assistance programs, we're sometimes struggling for graduation strategies. We're sometimes struggling to think about climate resilient livelihood integration. And I think that under the climate finance drive, there's room to bring those two areas of investment further closer together.
Thank you, Rodrigo, from your point of view.
Hello. Okay, it's working. So, of course, ADB has been a partner of DSWD for, I think, the longest time. And in fact, the ADB assisted us in developing our current social protection plan. So we'd like to acknowledge ADB support. But there are actually two things that if we really want to develop the system, adaptive and shock responsive social protection system, one is on, I hope that we can improve our targeting system to include climate and disaster risk information. So how do we integrate those information in terms of targeting really not only the poor, but who are the at risk and vulnerable? And of course, it comes with, so how are we going to finance it?
Sure.
If they have. And I think the second one is, we have several social assistance programs, and it's not only in terms of using the same system for addressing new objectives. It's actually, we have to align both the form and the function of the program to the broader objective of social adaptive and social protection program. And that would, of course, include building the capacity of the institution. So I think that too would greatly assist the Philippine government in moving towards that ASRSP.
Thank you so much. Bayoga, one thing we can do.
Okay, everybody needs to be aligned with the government policy. That's one thing. Because we have the plan, we have the budget, and we have the capacity. Maybe I can ask, maybe invite like ADB, try to give us some social, maybe technical assistance or something like that. But the system itself needs to be well, maintained and also well developed actually. For instance, like we have the medium-term development plan that's already been adopted there, the adaptive social protection, clearly there. So we need to make sure that it will be put there, and then the investment is coming later. And then another one that I would like to maybe Dolores mentioned about the targeting, because targeting is very important. Like the one that asked by a colleague from Fiji, the update, and Daniel also mentioned about the update of the targeting. Because we have actually like the MOSA, that's monthly targeting, update actually. So we can propose and we can reject actually, based on the community, base actually, proposal. So that's the way we are trying to have this kind of targeting to reduce actually the what we call the error actually, exclusion error actually.
Thank you, Payoga. Agnes, from your side, one point that ADB can do more on social protection.
Well, I think the ADB is doing a great job at partnering. Establishing this this platform of CRPP is incredibly useful, and I think we're really looking forward to work with you. We are already engaged in co-financing, so I think the capacity of ADB to catalyze and work as a partner in the financing common is something that is of incredible value.
Thank you, Agnes, so much. So with that, let's give a big round of applause to all our panelists. But I would also like to thank my colleagues, Amir, Timi, Wang, Anand, Palak, who also helped organize this session. Thank you so much. We look forward to taking the recommendations back and hopefully working with all of you in implementing it. Thanks a lot. And sorry for extremely bad time management. Apologies for that. Thank you so much.
See you again. Sure. Oh, God. Get in, right. You get the prize. You get the prize on time presentation.